Hi, I want to start by thanking the PLMW organizers for inviting me to talk today. It's a really special thing to have a chance to talk to people much earlier in their career and share some of the lessons I wish I had known back then. This talk is going to center primarily on psychology and mental health, two things that I knew virtually nothing about when I started my career, and I've had to learn a lot about the hard way. When I look back over my career on paper, it feels like I've really made my dreams come true. I started with a PhD at Northeastern University doing research on programming languages and concurrency. My dissertation was very successful. It won awards. I went on to do a postdoc with Derek Dreyer at MPI, and then switched gears to industrial research and helped lead the Rust team at Mozilla through releasing Rust to the world. These days, I work as a software engineer at Fastly, where I get to help incorporate language technologies like WebAssembly at the frontiers of the internet. So it's been very exciting. I've gotten to do a lot of really interesting work with a lot of really interesting people. But there's been a dark side to this whole story for me. Along the way, my choice to pivot to industrial research was partly the result of essentially having a mental breakdown when I began to interview for faculty positions. When I went on to work with Rust, a version of the same story ultimately played out, where over a few years, things grew to a place where I couldn't sustain it anymore. I, again, had a kind of breakdown and burned out on what I was doing in Rust and had to switch gears again. Now, those breakdowns were, of course, these really dramatic moments in my story. But this is a story that played out over the course of 15 years. And the decline of my mental health happened in a gradual way that was often hard to notice. Some of the early signs showed up around work deadlines, where I might spend a whole day doing nothing but feeling stressed out about the deadline, but unable to actually do any work toward that deadline. I would always break through and eventually get the thing turned in on time, but that period of stress got more and more intense as the years went by. If I had a setback in my work, I might start to panic or feel like I was worthless as a person and enter a period of depression. And eventually these things became pretty pervasive, to the point that when I was working on Rust, I was experiencing some amount of anxiety bordering on panic on a pretty much daily basis. So as you can imagine, over those years, I tried lots of different things to help improve my mental health and cope with these difficult feelings. But it's really only been in the last 3 years or so that I've started to recover at a deeper level and change the way my mind operates. This talk is going to focus on one particular aspect of that recovery, which is changing the way that I relate to my feelings. When I look back at the history of feelings for me, I start sort of in high school and early college, where feelings were very central. I had a lot of them. I spent a lot of time thinking about them, feeling them, talking to people about them, trying to sort them out. But over time, as I got into my academic career, my posture toward feelings started to shift. I was talking earlier about things like anxiety, feeling so stressed that I wasn't able to get work done. And I developed this mindset of feelings just getting in the way of being able to think clearly, being able to be productive. It's really easy to get into a mindset that negative feelings in particular are standing in the way of living the life you actually want to live. There's a broader cultural context too. Aside from feelings often being unpleasant, in at least some Western culture, there's a sense of looking down on feelings as irrational, disproportionate to the situations that they're arising in. They're unpredictable, you can't control them, and they often come with these kinds of urges toward action that we later regret. And finally, of course, working in computing, is sometimes attractive precisely because it seems to be absent of feeling. It seems to be a sort of realm of pure mathematics, of black and white truths. One of the basic messages of this talk is that feelings actually make a lot of sense, that they are a deeply rational aspect of being a human. At their core, feelings are impulses that drive us either towards something or away from something. And those impulses are really important information about us, about what we need, what we value, what we care about, and about our past experiences. Feelings connect our minds and our bodies. They draw the attention of the mind to things that our brain considers important, and they provide our bodies with energy to address whatever that important thing is, whether it's a need or a danger. And so the idea that feelings are a distraction is not wrong. Their whole point, in some sense, is to get our attention and get us moving. And finally, feelings are how we experience ourselves and the world, rather than just knowing about or thinking about those things. It's easiest to understand these points when we start in the physical realm. We have some very basic physical needs, like the need for food. The feeling of hunger is our mind and our body's way of getting our attention, letting us know we need food, and inspiring us, motivating us, giving us energy to take action to meet that need. Sometimes that process is so ingrained that it's barely even conscious. You can be thinking hard about something and suddenly find yourself standing in front of the refrigerator looking for food because that urge for hunger has started up a whole program that you're used to following. Hunger is an example of an impulse toward something, toward meeting the need for food. In the physical realm, we also have impulses away from things. If you had a past incident with a dog where you got hurt, maybe when you were really young, that could develop a fear of dogs. And you may find yourself, when you're passing by a dog on the street, automatically sort of steering your body away. Of course, most dogs that you meet on the street are not actually dangerous, but it's easy to see how that emotional reaction was formed in a deeply rational response to an earlier situation. And it's an example of your mind and your body working together to keep you safe through emotional responses. That's all pretty clear at the physical level, but the same kinds of things happen socially and with other kinds of needs that are part of human psychology. These more abstract needs can feel a little bit easier to blow off, right? It's obvious that our bodies need food to survive, but it's less obvious that we need friendship to survive. But these more psychological needs are wired into our brains. And something like that system exists in all mammals, not just humans. To make that concrete, our need for friendship leads to feelings like affection. That creates an impulse toward someone else, an urge to get close to them, to build that trust, to build a relationship. Likewise, if we've seen someone bullying someone else, or if we've been bullied, that could turn into a fear, much like fear of a dog. That fear can lead us to avoid that bully or take action to protect ourselves. So even though the needs and the dangers here are more abstract than physical needs and dangers, they're still important, and the emotions around them are still rational mechanisms in response to those needs and dangers. So part of my argument here is that feelings as a core mechanism make sense. They're actually rational. But I do think in practice, we can end up with feelings that are irrational, uncontrollable, and disproportionate to the situations we find ourselves in. And it's actually kind of illuminating to compare this situation to what we see in computing. As I mentioned before, part of the appeal of computing is that on its face, it seems like this deeply rational, mathematical, black and white kind of realm where you can perfectly predict what's going to happen and everything is rational. And this is a recording, so I can't tell how many of you are laughing, but I think those of us with experience in computing know that the reality doesn't quite line up with that. computing systems or bits of code tend to start out in a very rational, predictable way, but as they grow, they tend to become less rational over time. And that can play out in a number of different ways. I think a really common one is that there are outdated assumptions or designs that are deeply embedded in a system, but the system has gotten too large for it to be practical to go back and change those things. Other systems could even be depending on those outdated designs. And in general, as systems grow in complexity, they become harder and harder to predict, and there can be behaviors that are difficult to explain. So the analogy I want to draw here is that for both our emotions and computing, there's a highly rational set of mechanisms or sort of starting point for what's going on. But over time, those mechanisms lead to legacy code or emotional baggage. So emotions are a rational, important mechanism that makes sense, but they need maintenance. And I'm going to spend the rest of this talk covering what that maintenance looks like. The goal of maintenance here is to reach a state of emotional health. You are emotionally healthy if most of the time you can tolerate your feelings enough to listen to all of them and then consciously choose how to respond to the situation. This is an idea I'm going to come back to again and again from different angles. It's really the key slide of the talk. I've already talked a little bit about the dynamics around emotion that can make emotional health challenging. We have an emotional part of our brain that's designed to react strongly and quickly to situations that we find ourselves in. That's partly because they're trying to keep us safe in potentially life-threatening situations. Sometimes we don't have time to consciously come up with a plan. We need to act now. Feelings are there to motivate us toward that action, and they often come with a habitual strategy attached, right? Something that's worked to keep us safe in the past comes up as the immediate suggestion, and if the feeling is strong, the urge to employ that strategy is also strong. There are a few different things that can make feelings strong. Aside from the obvious life-threatening physical situations, you might have some situations in your past where you experienced trauma, either physically or emotionally, or were otherwise hurt. Or there might be some need or desire that you have been habitually pushing aside for one reason or another. And the feelings attached to that need get louder and louder over time because your mind is trying to make sure that need gets met. And the problem is when those feelings get really strong, they have a tendency to dominate our mind, to crowd out other competing feelings that might be suggesting different responses. They can crowd out our sense of our own values and who we are. And so the key point of emotional health is developing the capacity to sit with those strong feelings and then see what else is there in your mind. That's how you foster this slower brain response, this conscious response to the things that you're feeling. Another key point is that you can't do this alone. Emotional health is fundamentally a social endeavor, and this is again something that's actually built into all mammals. In the case of humans, the way this looks is often venting your feelings, getting validation or input from others, or just being around their calmness to help steady difficult feelings that you're experiencing. And this is especially true when we're children, because our brains actually literally lack the full capacity to regulate our emotions that will develop over time. And so we need our caretakers to act as a kind of external regulator. And if things go well, we internalize that ability to regulate. But even as adults, there will be times when the emotion is too overwhelming and we need to seek out regulation from outside of us. It's actually kind of helpful to walk through the developmental process in understanding how we might treat our own emotions. Let's start out with how it can look in childhood and what a helpful response from an adult might look like, and go from there. Let's take a really common childhood experience of falling and scraping your knee. if you've spent a lot of time around young kids, you might have noticed something interesting that happens when they do fall down. Before they even start to cry or react to what happened, they look to their grown-up and they gauge the response coming from their grown-up to understand how they should respond to their situation. Once they've made that eye contact, they might begin to cry. And here's how an ideal adult response might play out. When the kid comes over, the adult could say, "You're crying. I think you're scared and sad. That makes sense. It must have hurt. You can snuggle with me. And when you're ready, we can talk about it." And each of these phrases represents a key step in processing our own emotions, even as adults. The first step is to notice the feeling that's happening in our body. Emotions happen in our body, and that's how we notice them. It's obvious when we're crying, but we can also notice emotions through tension or other kinds of physical signs. So first you notice the feeling in your body. Then you translate that feeling into language. You name it. You say scared, sad, hurt. Next comes validating the feeling, saying that makes sense. It must have hurt. And ideally this validation points to the underlying need or condition of safety, danger, whatever it was that caused that emotional reaction in the first place. Validating that reaction is part of the process of beginning to soothe the emotion and choose a conscious response. We can also take that soothing step in a more explicit way by providing comforting presence, not trying to make the feeling go away, just being present with it, staying steady and calm. And then finally, once the emotion has been heard out and validated, we're in a position to begin to consciously respond. So that's the ideal case. And the hope is, if you have a parent who approaches your feelings this way, you'll learn to approach them that way yourself as an adult. But most of us weren't so lucky. Most of us had parents who didn't fully understand how to deal with their own emotions, and they passed on bad habits around emotional health to us. And that can take a lot of different shapes. So sticking with this example of a scraped knee, if you're on a playground, you might observe a wide range of responses that don't look very much like the ideal one. And what these responses tend to have in common is saying that the feeling itself is the problem rather than the scrape. One way we tend to do that is by denying the problem, by saying, "It's okay, it's not that bad, shh." And on the surface, this can feel like it's a very reasonable, comforting kind of thing to do. And that makes sense, right? In the end, we do want to get to the point where we can put that scrape into context and say, it is okay, you're safe. But we can't skip directly to that step. First, we need to name and validate the feelings as a real thing, to say, this was an intense experience. It makes sense that you're crying. If we skip too quickly past those steps, we teach the child that their experiences are not to be trusted, they're not valid, their emotions are disproportionate, and they should just buckle down and get on with it. Sometimes that lesson is even more direct when we just say, shh, don't cry. At that point, we're directly targeting the bodily emotional response to what happened and saying that's the problem. And often what's going on there is the parent is uncomfortable with that feeling. The parent doesn't know how to tolerate feelings in themselves. They don't know how to tolerate other people seeing their kids having feelings, and they're just trying to shut it down. In a different direction, parents often offer some kind of distraction, right? Like, here's a toy, or here's a snack, something to get the kid's mind off of the pain of the scrape. And again, on its surface, this looks like a kind and comforting thing to do, but it's skipping past that step of really acknowledging, naming, and validating the feelings. And it teaches the child to deal with difficult feelings by trying to replace them with something else, distract them. And as you go into adulthood, those strategies can turn into things like eating disorders and addictions, where we're perpetually trying to keep our negative feelings at bay by reaching out for some kind of more positive distraction. So let's connect this explicitly back to emotional health. To develop good emotional health, we need to develop the skills of tolerating the feelings that we have. But if we had a childhood where we're taught that negative feelings are themselves a problem, we're pretty unlikely to develop those skills. We're going to actively avoid those negative feelings or avoid processing them. But beyond that, if your caretakers in childhood responded to your negative emotions by themselves getting angry or shaming you, you carry that into adulthood as well. So, as an adult, you might find that when you start to feel sad about something, you then have a secondary reaction of panic. And that can look very confusing and irrational. But what's going on is that you were taught over and over as a child that expressing hurt or sadness through things like crying was a problem, would get people angry at you, it would get you in trouble. And so it's natural that you would then develop a fear of being sad. That makes emotional health even harder because it means you're feeling not just one strong emotion, but a whole cascade of reactions to it. That makes it harder to tolerate the total amount of emotion that's going on. It makes it harder to consciously understand why you're feeling the way that you're feeling. So, what happens when we're not able to tolerate our feelings? Well, sort of by definition, we're not able to fully feel them. We're not able to keep them in our awareness. We're not able to be fully conscious of them. Instead, we develop unconscious strategies like patterns that help us manage and push away those negative feelings. But the feelings are not resolved, and the needs and dangers that they pointed to are still there. As a result, the feelings still end up influencing our behavior, but in ways that we're no longer consciously aware of. And that's part of what can make emotions seem so unpredictable and uncontrollable and leading us to actions that we don't understand. This is something that develops slowly over time as the result of poor emotional health. Now I want to switch gears and get a little bit more concrete about some of the emotional impulses that we have and what they look like in their healthy and less healthy versions. So I'm going to talk about the 4Fs. These are basic instinctual responses to danger or need, and two of them are pretty familiar: fight and flight. But the overall matrix is a little bit more complicated than that. Let's imagine for a second that you're part of a research group that has a member named John. And John is a little bit of a bully with a tendency to take up all the space and shut down other people's ideas. But today you're coming into a research meeting with a really good, important idea that's going to help advance your research career. Sure enough, though, once you start sharing about your idea, John steps in. And there are a bunch of different reactions that you might have in the moment. One option is to somehow engage directly with John to protect yourself and your idea. At one extreme, you could start fighting with him. You could confront him about the fact that he's stepping all over your idea and try to claim the space for yourself. At the other extreme, you could try to essentially suck up to him, figure out what is it that he's trying to get here, give him that while still trying to get what you want out of the meeting. That's a Fawn response. On the other hand, you could take a strategy that's more avoiding the danger that John poses to you. So when he starts to stomp over your idea, you could try to run away. You could use a flight response. That might look like changing the subject, getting your idea out of the line of fire so that you can find a better way to introduce it. Or you could freeze up, you could shut down, see what John has to say, watch how other people are responding, and wait to make your next move. All of these instincts have a healthy role to play, depending on the situation. So healthy versions of fight, for example, look like being assertive or holding boundaries, being courageous. A flight response can look like knowing when to disengage or retreat. or putting in work to prepare so that you can sort of outrun some anticipated danger. Freeze response in a healthy version looks like being aware, conserving energy, being present, watching, observing, and learning. And finally, a healthy fawn response looks like being good at compromise, hearing out others, making peace, and looking for fair solutions. In an ideal world where you're emotionally healthy, you're going to have feelings that are pushing you toward these different strategies, and you're going to be able to listen to those feelings and consciously choose what strategy will serve you best in the given situation. If you're not so emotionally healthy, though, these kinds of strategies can become entrenched and unconscious, and you can keep employing them to try to get yourself out of danger, yet never feel safe enough to stop. Let's walk through what this looks like for each of the different strategies. With flight, the idea is that we're going to keep ourselves safe by outrunning or getting away from the danger. If the danger is social, this strategy at its extreme can look like perfectionism. We can have this idea that we could keep ourselves perfectly safe from judgment or criticism from others if only we could make our work perfect enough that it was uncriticizable. To be clear, there's nothing wrong with the strategy of trying to do good work and avoid criticism. But perfectionism is what happens when we don't have good emotional health in this area, when the feelings that come from being criticized are just intolerable for us. Then we develop this strategy to try to avoid those feelings at all costs. But unfortunately, we're going to be stuck there forever because nothing we can do will permanently avoid the possibility of being criticized. So until we learn to tolerate those feelings, we're never really going to feel safe. Another form of unhealthy flight response is using distraction. And here, the idea is not so much that we are avoiding the danger as much as avoiding our feelings. Distraction, as I mentioned earlier, can take lots of different shapes. It can look like staying busy at work, or consuming substances or food. Anything to take your mind away from a feeling that's intolerable to you. The same basic dynamic plays out here. You're going to be stuck in this loop of distraction until you can improve your emotional health and come to tolerate the feelings you're trying to avoid. Next up is the fawn response. So as a reminder, fawn is about keeping yourself safe by appeasing whatever's threatening you. A good sign that you lean on your fawn response is if you were often told as a child that you were very mature for your age. You were learning what the adults around you wanted to see from you and practicing that skill of fawning and giving them what they want. Now, as I said before, fawning has positive and healthy aspects. Being able to really listen to people and understand where they're coming from can be a great skill. But things can get unhealthy if you have an emotional intolerance to people being upset with you or disappointed. That can lead to an entrenched fawn response, where you start to have a really hard time saying no to people. And then you find yourself deeply overcommitted and miserable. At an extreme, you can start to lose the sense of yourself because you spend all of your time trying to live up to what everybody else around you wants to see. Until you get more emotionally healthy around that intolerance of disappointment and anger, you're going to be stuck in that strategy. Next up, we have the freeze response. And the idea of freezing is to try to hide from danger, conserve energy, observe, and find a moment to do something different in the future. In the unhealthy version, that can look like procrastination or hiding parts of yourself, isolating and withdrawing, and overall narrowing your life by disengaging with anything that feels dangerous. The same kinds of patterns are at play here. All of these different unhealthy versions of freeze represent some emotional intolerance that you're trying to work around. Finally, we have the fight response. And the principle here is that you're going to try to respond to danger by dominating or destroying it. In its unhealthy form, There's usually an emotion tied to weakness or vulnerability that you're struggling to tolerate. And if you're leaning on your fight response for this, you're trying to essentially overpower the person who might be raising those feelings in you, showing your strength to deny any possibility of weakness. And the same kind of stuck patterns play out here. You're never going to be able to get rid of all of your weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And if the only tool that you have to deal with that emotional intolerance is to fight, you're going to be fighting everyone and everything for the rest of your life. So at this point, we've talked a lot about feelings. What does it all add up to? Well, I hope I've convinced you a bit of the importance of this idea of emotional health. And just to reiterate, the goal is to be able to tolerate your feelings enough to listen to all of them and then consciously choose how to respond. Maybe you can relate to some of the unhealthy patterns I was describing before around perfectionism or procrastination or people pleasing. And part of the message here is those strategies ultimately come from a rational place, and they were necessary at some point for you to cope with what was going on in your emotional life. But often these strategies get stuck and shoved into our subconscious, and they might not be serving us so well now. You can learn new ways to respond to your feelings, but that requires improving your emotional health. To start recovering from mental illness, I had to transform the way that I related to my feelings. I had to start by accepting all of my feelings as allies, as parts of myself that were trying to protect me, even if it was sometimes in ways that felt irrational. A key part of that was learning to approach feelings with a sense of curiosity instead of trying to control them and make them go away. Feelings are really messages from a part of our brain that thinks we're in danger. And we need to learn how to fully receive that message for the feeling to feel heard out. It's only when we do that that we can get the feeling to kind of step back and make room for the other things that are around, including our values and other feelings that might be at play. Once we can do that, once we can sit down with all of our feelings, we can begin to more proactively choose how we're going to respond. When we start making new choices that look like different strategies than the ones that we're used to, that's going to feel uncomfortable for a long time because we have highly conditioned parts of ourselves that really believe that we need to employ our old strategies to keep ourselves safe. But if we can practice over and over making new choices, we can start to unravel that conditioning and form new habits. When you do this consistently over time, you can start to train the emotional part of your brain that it can trust the slower, more conscious part of your brain to hear it out and respond. And similarly, that more conscious part can come to trust and value what the feelings have to say. Improving your emotional health is a difficult process that needs a lot of support. I've listed some of the most important supports that I've gotten along the way here on this slide. I think where a lot of people start is with this concept of psychoeducation, which is to learn more about psychology and begin to identify the kind of unconscious patterns that you find in your own behaviors. Growing that awareness can be really helpful. But just learning new ideas is not enough to improve your emotional health. It's fundamentally about experiences, about having those feelings and learning to tolerate them. One of the best places to do that kind of work is in therapy. An experienced therapist will know how to find little pockets of emotional intolerance for you and slowly and gently guide you toward them, increasing your exposure bit by bit and giving you a supportive environment for exploring those feelings. I've listed some keywords for particular forms of therapy that I found helpful if you're searching for a therapist. Another way to get support is through your relationships. And here you can learn to practice sharing feelings while they're still big. That is, before you've really worked through them. It's different than telling a story about feelings where you kind of already know how the story ends. It's about opening up when your feelings are feeling overwhelming and getting support from a friend. There are also some techniques that apply just directly to your ability to tolerate or be aware of emotions. Meditation is a great way to do that. But medication, like antidepressants and exercise, can both help improve your overall tolerance for difficult feelings. I'm going to close out with a list of particular resources that have been helpful for me. The movie Inside Out by Pixar, in some ways, is a depiction of the contents of this talk. It really shows through a story the inner workings of the brain and how important it is to deal with both negative and positive feelings and integrate them together. I also give my Twitter handle here. I try to share frequently and freely about my own journey with mental health, and a lot of the themes that I've covered in this talk show up on my Twitter feed. I hope this talk has been helpful to you. As I said, it's a really delightful opportunity to share some of these lessons at a time in your careers where they can hopefully have a big impact. Thank you so much.